Golden State Media Concepts Fantasy Football Podcast is your one-stop shop for fantasy football news and advice. Can't decide on who to draft on the first round? Going gaga on how to line up your team. Got you covered. Traditional league, dynasty league, PPR league, IDP league, even daily fantasy football league. Join us as we break down all the questions of fantasy football. It's the Golden State Media Concepts Fantasy Football Podcast.
Hey there, everybody, and welcome to the 200th episode of the GSMC Fantasy Football Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. Guys, 200 episodes. It's been a long time coming, obviously, and we just want to thank every single one of you who takes the time out of your day to listen to our podcast, and those who write reviews, those who have commented in the past. We appreciate every single one of you, whether you've been here from day one, and whether, today's your first time ever listening. So with that, guys, I'm your host, Marcus Vargas, and, the sports world has been, very, very quiet recently in the wake of all the coronavirus pandemic and chaos. And, either way, the show must go on. So, we got a packed show for you today, guys, believe it or not. So let's get right into it. I want to start today on sort of a different note and talk more fantasy football. I want to give you guys my fantasy football rankings sort of updated after this first wave of the free agency frenzy and give you my top 5 picks at each position for next year's fantasy football season. Of course, this is going to get updated again as free agency rolls around and the draft rolls around. But for right now, I want to give you my updated picks after this first wave of free agency. Now, of course, I'm going to start with quarterback because, like I always say, it's the most important position on the field. At number 1, Lamar Jackson. Guys, Lamar Jackson is an absolute stud for fantasy football, and he's a stud on the football field in general. While I don't think, he's going to put up as insane numbers he put up last year, I still think he's going to be fantasy's best quarterback because of the ability he has to run with his legs. It's absolutely insane. And it's actually unprecedented. He's in the record books. So if he continues to do that, even if he slightly dips in production, he's still going to finish as fantasy's top quarterback. Now, Patrick Mahomes I have as a very, very close second. And that's just because he has insane production with his arm. He's only one of 3 guys to have 50 touchdowns and 5,000 yards. And, he'll only be going into, his 4th year? So, rely on Patrick Mahomes to give you another great fantasy football season, and, barring any injuries, he's going to finish as fantasy's number 2 or even number 1 quarterback. His arm talent is great, and his weapons aren't going anywhere, guys. They're still there, at least for next year, and even though, he may lose Sammy Watkins wasn't much of a factor all of the regular season to begin with. After that first game in Jacksonville where he had 200-some yards and I think it was 2+ touchdowns, he sort of just went away. He disappeared. He wasn't relevant at all. So, he still has Mecole Hardman, still has Tyreek Hill, still has Travis Kelce, guys. And Mecole Hardman is only going to get better from here. So, look for Patrick Mahomes at the number 2 spot. At number 3, guys, this may surprise some people, I have Kyler Murray. Guys, the addition of DeAndre Hopkins is absolutely huge for Kyler Murray. And, last year, on a points per game basis, he finished as QB 11. So if you take that into account, add one of the greatest receivers we've seen in recent memory, and it's going to result in fantasy success. I truly believe that he'll be a top 5 quarterback. Also because he can use his legs a lot, and I think he'll begin to use his legs more and more. Also, guys, DeAndre Hopkins is really, really going to help Kyler Murray with his off-schedule throws. when he's scrambling out of the pocket and he has, I get it. Larry Fitzgerald, he's a GOAT, Larry Legend, no disrespect to him, but he's aging. He's definitely not as good as DeAndre Hopkins right now. And DeAndre Hopkins is going to provide a huge boost to that offense, a much needed boost. And I think it's going to boost Kyler Murray's production as well. At number 4, guys, I have Russell Wilson. Now, I'm not sure if you guys know this or not, but in each of the past 5 seasons, Russell Wilson has finished in the top 10 of fantasy football quarterbacks. Let that sink in for a bit, guys. Also, in 2017, he was fantasy football's number 1 scoring quarterback. So, this is an elite fantasy football quarterback we're talking about here, and I have him outside of the top 3. Never mind the fact that last year, he finished as fantasy's number 3 quarterback, so this is a downgrade. Russell Wilson has just done it time and time and again. He may be the best in the NFL at improvising and scrambling. Of course, him and Patrick Mahomes are very, very close, but Russell Wilson has a beautiful deep ball. He's great with his legs. He can escape so many situations and make amazing plays. I mean, we all remember that throw to Tyler Lockett in the back of the end zone. Everyone thought he was throwing it away. Man, I believe he did that on purpose, and that was all planned. Russell Wilson, number 4 fantasy football quarterback next season. And for my final spot at number 5, I'm actually going to put Dak Prescott. Yeah, I know, guys. I know we all love to hate on the Cowboys, but I just can't deny the guy's production and his numbers. Whether you believe, Dak Prescott's just, garbage time quarterback, he gets all his points, blah, blah, blah. It doesn't matter. We don't care about how they win games or how they get their numbers. We just care that they get their numbers. And last year he was fantasy football's number 2 quarterback. He threw 4,900 yards, guys, 30 touchdowns. I'll take that any day of the week. I don't think he's going to do as well next year, but we have to remember, he has Amari Cooper again. He's going to have relatively the same weapons, and Jason Witten, to me, was a waste of a space. I think Blake Jarwin should have been the starting tight end the entire time. Unfortunately, he wasn't getting that starting time, but I think he'll perform better than Jason Witten did last year and add, another potential weapon for Dak Prescott. They have the same offensive coordinator, and if we're to believe Mike McCarthy, Kellen Moore will be calling the plays just like he did last year. So that just means more fantasy football success for Dak Prescott. And I believe, even though, I'm as much of a Cowboy hater as the next guy, that Dak Prescott is going to be a top 5 fantasy football quarterback. So don't leave him on the boards just because he's the Cowboys quarterback, guys. I know a lot of people who literally will not draft him or they put him lower on their list just because, he's a quarterback for the Cowboys. They're going to finish 8-8 and, they always choke. But guys, it's not the case for fantasy football. So top 5 guys, just to go through them again: Lamar Jackson, Patrick Mahomes, Kyler Murray, Russell Wilson, and Dak Prescott for next year. That's it for my quarterbacks as of right now, and I want to move on to running backs. Now, before I get into these, I do want to mention that I'm going off of a PPR, sort of half PPR scoring format in mind. So, just, be wary of that. And also, I do want to say, we're not going to get through all the running backs before the break. However, don't worry. I'm going to continue in the next segment with these rankings. So, to top off this list, guys, I know before I had mentioned Saquon Barkley being, one of my picks for top fantasy football running backs next year. However, with the recent, free agency frenzy and Cam Newton no longer, being in the plans of the Carolina Panthers, I believe Christian McCaffrey is going to repeat as the number 1 fantasy football scoring running back. Now, the reason I believe this is because, Teddy Bridgewater is sort of he's mostly a game manager. And while he's a great game manager, I see a lot of dump offs to the running back, a lot of short passes to Christian McCaffrey in the future. With Cam, it was a bit different. He likes to push the ball down the field and he has a rocket arm. And I think, Matt Rule coming in, he saw what the Carolina Panthers did successfully, and I feel like he's sort of building around Christian McCaffrey as opposed to, getting this superstar quarterback and building around him. So for number 1, I got Christian McCaffrey, guys. For number 2, give me Saquon Barkley. I mean, guys, he missed 3 games last year and still finished as a top 10 fantasy football running back. And, it was a weird year for him. We weren't seeing as many explosive 20, 30-point games. There was like multiple games under 10 points. However, it was an injury-marred season. It was a sort of a dip season for him, and I feel like next year is going to be a great bounce-back season as the Giants, kind of find their identity and come into form more with Daniel Jones. He's more comfortable in the system. I feel like they're definitely going to perform better next year than they did this previous season, and that means more fantasy football success for Saquon Barkley. I mean, guys, he's clear and away the number one weapon on that team. They run the offense through him, and even, teams are going to be loading the box. It doesn't matter. We've seen him succeed with all the defensive attention on him. He can just make plays. He's insane catching the football. He's a perfect fantasy football running back, just like Christian McCaffrey is, because he can produce, taking the ball in his gut and, just slamming up the line. And he can also catch a ton of passes in a game. He's basically a wide receiver for the New York Giants as well. So Saquon Barkley, not quite number 1, but, he's definitely in that discussion, but I'll have him at number 2, guys. However, we are running out of time for this first segment here, guys, so we are going to take a short break, but right after, we're going to continue these rankings, and, we're going to talk wide receivers and tight ends as well, so don't worry. Stay tuned. We'll be right back after this.
Are you looking for the very best NFL and college football podcast? Then check out the GSMC Football Podcast. Get the latest football news both on and off the field. From the NFL Draft to trades to the rumor mill to the NFL Combines. They got you covered. That's GSMCpodcast.com/football-podcast. Get updates on college rivalries, game day insights, and much, much more. It's football talk the way you want it. This show eats, sleeps, and breathes football. Don't forget to like them on Facebook and follow them on Twitter. Visit GSMCpodcast.com for more info.
Alrighty, folks, we are back, and welcome to the GSMC Fantasy Football Podcast. We just got done talking some quarterback rankings for next season. We began talking about the running back rankings for next fantasy football season, so we're just going to continue there. Just to recap, if you might have forgotten, we had Christian McCaffrey at number 1 and Saquon Barkley at number 2. Now, for my number 3 spot, it's a guy who was absolutely on a tear last season, and he had a great bounce back year, Dalvin Cook. Now, guys, the reason why I don't have him, in the top 2 is because he has injury concern. Now, in his 3 years, he's yet to play a full 16 games, and he missed most of his first rookie season with a severe injury. So, the injury history is there, and while, Saquon, of course, he dealt with an injury this past season, but it wasn't as severe as Dalvin Cook's. With Stephon Diggs leaving Minnesota, that only leaves more touches for Dalvin Cook in the pass game and more runs for Dalvin Cook because, the team was going toward a more run-focused offense anyway. Now that you're losing a premier wide receiver, you're going to run the ball even more. And, more carries on running backs, guys, it really shortens their shelf life. So I'm concerned for Dalvin Cook, but I trust that he's going to produce very, very well. I mean, he absolutely exploded onto the scene last year. I'm not sure many people predicted the type of season that he was going to have, and the only reason he didn't finish higher than number 5 in fantasy football was because he missed the last couple games of the season. So expect him to produce again, of course, barring any injury, but definitely keep your eye on him because he seems injury prone, and that might be a risk with selecting him very, very high in your fantasy football draft. However, I'm still keeping him at number 3 because he was a great fantasy football running back last year, and I expect that to continue in an offense that looked to be focusing on the run. Now for number 4, Derrick Henry. Yes, guys, I know he's not a huge factor in PPR, half PPR leagues because he doesn't, catch that many passes. However, last year, he finished as fantasy's, he finished as a top 5 running back, and he barely catches the ball. Now, he had 300 attempts and 1,500 yards, and, he also had 16 touchdowns, guys. Not to mention, the team is sticking with Ryan Tannehill. They tagged him. So it seems like they're going to go with the same sort of formula that they had last year. Give Derrick Henry the ball and let him eat. Now, of course, they lost Jack Conklin, but I still expect Derrick Henry to just run through people. That's not going to change how good he is after contact and running through contact. Derrick Henry is a beast. He's their bell cow, and he isn't going anywhere at all. Expect him to produce a lot of numbers, and I don't have him finishing, top 3, top 2 like he just finished. This is a dip. So even though he's number 4, this would signify a dip in his fantasy production from last year. He's going to put up huge numbers, guys. He is always going to get touches at the goal line, which is huge for fantasy football, especially if you're in standard scoring, guys. He's going to finish higher than 4 in standard scoring. He's going to get a ton of touchdowns. He's huge, literally, and he's huge on the goal line for the Tennessee Titans. He's going to keep up the production, so keep him on your radar. I have him at number 4. Some people may have him higher or lower. However, I like to give love to those guys who don't really catch passes but can still put in that work. So again, number 4, Derrick Henry. Now, for my number 5 running back, and this one's, it might be a little controversial, Ezekiel Elliott. I know, guys, another Cowboy on my list. However, guys, we have to look at this. Last year, a lot of people treated Ezekiel Elliott like, oh, he had a down year. He's not the same kind of guy, and, this team's not running through him anymore. However, guys, he had over 1,300 yards rushing, and he had 12 touchdowns. Those are pretty great numbers for a guy who's regressing. If that's going to be his regression year, then I'll take that, and I'll, let's bank in on the bounce back year. Ezekiel Elliott is a fantastic running back, and even though we saw Dak Prescott, taking more control of the team with Kellen Moore calling the plays, he was still succeeding. We have to ignore that sort of, that notion that, like, if one guy has a year that's absolutely stellar and record-breaking, that he should be repeating that every year. It's sort of if we crucified Patrick Mahomes for not throwing 5,000 yards and 50 touchdowns every year, would that really make any sense? Records are records for a reason, and, guys aren't going to have record-breaking, phenomenal, top season, historical seasons every year. Ask any coach in the NFL if he'll take 1,300 yards and 12 touchdowns, and it would be very, very shocking if one said, nah, keep my guy. There's not many running backs that are doing this. Derrick Henry led the league with 1,500. That's great and all, but, Ezekiel Elliott on a quote-unquote down year, 1,357 yards, 12 touchdowns. He's going to keep producing. And, of course, I do want to mention, Travis Frederick has just recently retired. The Cowboys' offensive line is losing, a key piece. He was an absolutely great offensive lineman, and, even though his production, I guess we could say, or his play dipped recently, he was still a great lineman. His reason for retiring was he felt that he wasn't playing at his maximum level, which was elite. And so, he felt he couldn't give his all to the game anymore. But even so, he was still a above average offensive lineman last year. And that line has a lot to do with the success of Ezekiel Elliott and Dak Prescott as well. So we are going to see a dip in Ezekiel Elliott's production, but he's going to get a lot of touchdowns, which I think will make up for the yards lost in the run game. However, so we do have to temper our expectations. I have him at number 5. You could dip him below 6 or 7 because of the loss of the offensive lineman, but I think he's that great, and I think he'll do just fine in adjusting, and they'll figure it all out. Of course, another argument against Ezekiel Elliott here is that Kellen Moore is still calling the plays, and, it's Dak Prescott's team now, but, guys, I don't care about that nonsense. Ezekiel Elliott is an amazing running back. He's arguably, the best running back in football. So I have him at number 5, and we'll see what happens. So that's it for my top 5 running backs, guys. And now we're going to move into wide receivers. Now, guys, like I said, we're basing these rankings off of PPR, half PPR, just any sort of points per reception. And so for that reason, my number one is the New Orleans Saints receiver, Michael Thomas. Yes, I expect him to repeat as fantasy football's number one scoring wide receiver because he has insane amounts of receptions, guys. Last year, he had 149. In a standard PPR league, that is 149 points that he would not have in a standard scoring league and that he would not have in a half PPR league. In half PPR, that would only amount to 75, around 74 points. So it's absolutely insane the amount of points he's getting per season just on receptions. There are some wide receivers that don't score 149 a year total, with receptions, yards, and touchdown. He's scoring that just with receptions. So it's pretty insane what he's doing, and I expect him to repeat that again as the true number one, the biggest weapon on the Saints. Kamara's not that big of a weapon at this point in time. He wasn't last year, and Michael Thomas, that's his team. Drew Brees, that's his safety outlet. He is always open, it seems, no matter what, and he always has his hands on the ball, making a catch. And remember, guys, it's not all about getting a ton of yards. Even though, he has no problem with his 1,700 yards last year. It's absolutely insane, the production that he had. But all he needs to do is just keep catching the ball, keep being consistent, and he's going to keep finishing as, a top fantasy football wide receiver. So, Michael Thomas, number one, and that's kind of, with no doubt in my mind, I can say that. Right now, though, guys, we are running out of time, so we're going to continue these rankings after a short break. We're going to finish wide receivers, get into tight ends, and possibly discuss some defenses. So, yeah, today's show, guys, a lot of rankings, a lot about fantasy football. But, yeah, hope you're enjoying it, and we'll be right back after the break.
Check out the show that's built on the MMA, from the UFC to extreme cage fighting. They got the fights covered. Check out the GSMC MMA podcast. Get the latest news on past or upcoming fights. Join us as we talk to and about some of the biggest names in the MMA, past, present, and future. When it's the fight game, there's just one show to check out. GSMCpodcast.com/MMA-podcast. Don't forget to like them on Facebook and follow them on Twitter. Visit GSMCpodcast.com for more info.
Alrighty, guys, welcome back to the GSMC Fantasy Football Podcast's 200th episode. And guys, I know we've been talking, a ton of fantasy football and rankings, but it only feels right that for the 200th episode, we discuss, what I feel is going to happen in the fantasy football season for next year. Now, we left off, I gave you guys my number one pick for fantasy football wide receiver for 2020, and that was Michael Thomas. Now, let's continue. For my number two fantasy football wide receiver of the 2020 football season, Tyreek Hill. Yes, guys, I feel that Tyreek Hill is going to play a full 16 games. He's going to stay healthy next year. And with Patrick Mahomes as his quarterback, staying healthy, of course, they're going to light it up. The only reason, I don't have Tyreek Hill at number one, if I'm being honest here, is because he's not going to get anywhere near the amount of receptions that Michael Thomas is, and that's a huge boost. I do want to say, Tyreek Hill only had 58 receptions last year. He missed a ton of games due to injury, but he still had 860 yards and 7 touchdowns. So, that production is pretty insane for only having 58 receptions, and he missed, I think it was 5 or 6 games. With a full 16 games, guys, he's going to do great. He's finished as a top 2, top 3 fantasy receiver in the past, and he's only going to get better, and that offense isn't going anywhere. Not to mention, if we lose the weapon in Sammy Watkins, that's just more targets to go around and, more targets for a wide open streaking Tyreek Hill down the field. Of course, the way he's scoring points is different than Michael Thomas, and, he's not benefiting so much from that PPR, getting points per catch, but those deep balls, those deep touchdowns, touchdowns in fantasy, that's money in the bank. So Tyreek Hill, a big play guy, he basically, in every game, you're going to see him get a 4-point fantasy play because he's catching a deep ball for 40 yards. So it's pretty awesome to watch. Fun to have him on your fantasy football team because it's fun to watch the amazing play, and to know you're getting great points from that as well is awesome too. So I have Tyreek Hill as my number 2 fantasy football wide receiver, and I know a lot of people might not have him there. They disrespect him a bit because he's not as big in the PPR scene because he's not catching so many balls per game. But number 2, guys, Tyreek Hill. For number 3, this is where I'm putting DeAndre Hopkins. And I know, it sounds kind of crazy to put, Tyreek Hill over DeAndre because DeAndre catches a ton of balls. So, that could be interchangeable. But I got DeAndre Hopkins at number 3. Of course, we have yet to see what he's going to do in the Cardinals offense, but it's DeAndre Hopkins, guys. He constantly finishes as the top fantasy football wide receiver. I've talked about his production before, and that production definitely isn't going to dip just because he's on a new team now. If anything, I feel that his production might even go up. I feel he's actually more of that number 1 target on the Cardinals than he was on the Texans. To me, I'd rather have Will Fuller as my number 2 than, a really aging Larry Fitzgerald at this point in time. Now, of course, this all, hangs upon if Kyler Murray's going to take a step forward rather than a step back, but everything points to him taking a step forward. Also, with that sort of weapon and security blanket, you can expect Kyler Murray to do well. That's why I had him ranked so high in my quarterback rankings. And so sort of in tandem with that, I have to put DeAndre Hopkins up here. It only seems right. It only makes sense. DeAndre Hopkins is a fantastic wide receiver in general, and so he's going to have fantasy football success no matter where he is, I feel. So DeAndre Hopkins is my number 3 guy, but he could easily finish number 2 and maybe even steal number 1 from Michael Thomas if he dips in production. So these top 3 guys, I wouldn't have Tyreek Hill as number 1, but, those top 3 guys are sort of interchangeable. My number 4 guy that I actually have, and this may come as a surprise to some folks, is Davante Adams of the Green Bay Packers. Now, I know we saw, a huge dip last year, and that's because he missed 4 games due to that nagging toe injury. But, guys, Davante Adams is a stud. In Green Bay's offense, he basically is the only weapon. And like I said, for PPR purposes, that's a ton of targets and a ton of catches, and that's going to translate into fantasy success. Like I said, he missed 4 games last year, and he was 3 yards away from 1,000 yards. Now, he only had 5 touchdowns, which of course was a concern, but if he bounces back next year and he stays healthy, he's going to produce in that offense. Aaron Rodgers is still his quarterback. He's still a great wide receiver, and, they're going to put up numbers together. Let's not forget that in the 2018 season, Davante Adams was the number 3 fantasy football wide receiver. And, I forgot to mention, Tyreek Hill was number 1 that year. So, Davante Adams has that potential to be, a top 3, top 5 wide receiver. I think he bounces back next season, and I think, they come back hungry. That NFC Championship loss is definitely going to fuel them. So look for Davante Adams to have a bounce back year and finish as a top 5 fantasy football wide receiver. Now, for my number 5 fantasy football wide receiver for next season. And, actually, I want to preface this, listen, guys, I'm not picking Chris Godwin or Mike Evans here just because I feel that it's so hard to choose between both of them and which one is going to get, more targets and more yards from Tom Brady. I have to kind of wait and see. I feel like Tom Brady is going to have a better rapport with one of them rather than, I don't feel that he's going to throw 5,000 yards like Jameis Winston did. I feel they're going to produce and they're going to, hold on to they're going to take more time to score points. I do believe Tom Brady's going to be wildly productive with them, and they are all too. But I feel like it's going to be, one guy's going to benefit much more than the other rather than both of them having as much success as they did last year. So while I would want to pick Chris Godwin or Mike Evans, I want to hold off for now. And for my number 5 guy as of right now, I'm going to pick Julio Jones. It feels like Julio Jones is he's tried and he's true and he's consistent. Yes, there's that big concern in the touchdown department. It's been a big concern in recent years, but, last year, 99 receptions, 1,394 yards, 6 touchdowns, good enough for a top 5 finish. I'll take that, guys. I mean, I understand that, Matt Ryan hasn't been, the MVP of the league again, and, it's sort of frustrating, but we have to realize that Julio Jones is performing no matter what in fantasy football, and if he can continue to rack up a ton of points, a ton of catches, it's good for us. He's constantly the focal point of that offense, and without Devontae Freeman there, I don't believe Todd Gurley's just going to become some mega weapon in the Falcons' offense. I feel that, it just leaves open more targets for Julio Jones, Calvin Ridley, and the other receivers. I feel like he's going to have another top 5 finish. In PPR, he finished, number 3 last year, so just keep your eyes on Julio Jones to finish another very productive season. Even when his team isn't doing that well and not making playoffs, he's huge for fantasy football. And with that, we're going to go into a short break because we don't have much time to start getting into the tight ends and defenses, so I don't want to, cut it short again. We'll go into a short break now, and right after, we'll talk tight ends and we'll talk defenses, and then move on to our final 2 topics of the day. So thank you for sticking with us, guys. I hope you've been enjoying the rankings, and of course, if you agree or disagree, let me know in the comments below, and we can discuss. So we'll be right back after this break. Stay tuned.
Check out the show built around the women of MMA. From the UFC to the extreme cage fighting, we got the fights covered.
Listen.
It's the Golden State Media Concepts Women's MMA Podcast. The latest news of upcoming fights, discussions of previous matches. Join us as we talk to and about the biggest names in women's mixed martial arts, past, present, and future. When it's the women's fight game, you know where to listen to. The Golden State Media Concepts Women's MMA Podcast.
All right, guys, welcome back to the GSMC Fantasy Football Podcast. We're about to start wrapping up our fantasy football rankings for the 2020 season after the first wave of free agency this year, and we finally come onto the tight ends for 2020. It's the last skill position we have here, and it's sort of easy to go through. I talk about this, all the time. Everyone is well aware of this, that tight end is just, probably the most scarce position in fantasy football. If you don't get one of the top 3 to top 5 guys, you sort of interchange the rest. So let's just go through it here. This is definitely going to be a quicker one because, it's pretty obvious every year who's going to finish as top tight ends. I know there's always a certain surprise. Darren Waller was a big surprise last year. Austin Hooper I didn't see coming as well. But let's just get into it. My number 1 guy, and it's not just because he's a Kansas City Chief, it's because he's an absolute stud, and he finished as number 1 last year, Travis Kelce. Guys, as long as Patrick Mahomes is his quarterback, I would trust Travis Kelce to finish as fantasy football's number 1 wide receiver every year. Now, of course, it's always going to be a toss-up, him or George Kittle, but, George Kittle is used in other ways as well. He has more utility, and he's not used. He's used just as much in the pass game, but there's a lot of plays where he's just blocking, and so that takes away from the snaps that he's catching balls. He finished with 12 more catches than George Kittle last year, so it's not a ton, but I would always trust him to have more catches, more yards, and that equals more fantasy production. So for my number 1. I have Travis Kelce. He's in such a prolific passing offense, it's very hard to say he wouldn't finish as number 1 again. As of right now, Kansas City doesn't have, they've got the same running back, so I don't expect him, all of a sudden become the focal point of the offense and rush for 1,200 yards. So, as of right now, Travis Kelce, still number 1. Number 2, I think it's pretty obvious, guys, George Kittle of the San Francisco 49ers. I mean, the guy's an absolute stud, like I said, and if not, if he wasn't used so much in the run game and blocking, and if San Francisco didn't run the ball so much, he would probably be number one, or, it'd be a tie, basically. It'd be very, very hard to choose. He's an absolute stud. He has wiggle like Travis Kelce. He's great in the pass game, and he can also run block a ton. But he's probably going to finish as fantasy football's number 2 tight end for next year. But, of course, him and Travis Kelce are going to be battling it out all year. Now, for my number 3 guy, Carson Wentz's biggest security blanket, Zach Ertz. I know it seems kind of cliche at this point to have, this big 3 as the top 3 fantasy football tight ends, but they're reliable and they're consistent. Zach Ertz is, clearing away, the Eagles' favorite target on offense. He had 916 receiving yards last season, which led the team, and, he's a stud. He's a great possession tight end. The ball always seems to find him, and his hands always seem to find the ball, so I'd bet on him to finish as number 3. He's going to be, of course, one of the top 3, top 5 guys in fantasy football yet again. He's an elite tight end, great hands. Always, especially on those plays, 3rd and longs, need a first down. Zach Ertz is probably getting the ball, and on the goal line, if they're passing it, look for Zach Ertz to get the touchdown as well. So, Zach Ertz as my number 3 fantasy football tight end for the 2020 football season. For number 4, and it's starting to get in sort of that toss-up category where, they all sort of start to blend. But for my number 4 guy, I'm going to take Mark Andrews of the Baltimore Ravens. And this is because, he was basically Lamar Jackson's security blanket last year. And they just let go of one of their tight ends, so there's, less tight ends to take any targets from him. And he played very, very well. It seemed like every time Lamar Jackson threw him the ball, he was basically wide open 5 yards away from the defender. Of course, I would say that has to do a lot with the threat of Lamar Jackson running the football. But so what? If it's making him put up numbers, he's going to put up numbers. Do I think he could finish higher than Zach Ertz? Yes. But as of right now, I want to see Lamar Jackson get more comfortable in the pass game. If he becomes more of has more pocket presence and can just, launch the ball a ton and not rely on running so often, Mark Andrews is definitely going to see a huge boost and could possibly finish, number 2, number 1. But for right now, I think, he is going to dip a bit. Teams, when they watch that film, they're going to study the Ravens offense and get used to it more. It was the first year we got to see Lamar Jackson start the full 16 games. We got to see him take control of the offense, and they built it specifically for him. And now we're going to see what happens, when the defenses have a full 16 games of films on them and see what they do. So I do, think that the production on the receiving side is going to dip. Now, for my number 5 guy, this is actually tough because I'm not sure who to put here. It feels like I could put a ton of people in here. Before this season, before this free agency stuff happened and everything went crazy, I would have put Hunter Henry here because Phillip Rivers was his quarterback, and he's a great tight end. He's a productive guy. After he came back off of injury, he was putting up a ton of numbers, and it was pretty impressive what he was doing. I didn't even think he would come back. He missed, I think 4 or 5 games, and he still finished his fantasy number 8. He finished in the top 10 of fantasy football tight ends, which just goes to show you, how weak that position is in fantasy football. But that's not the case. So for my number 5 guy, let's see here. I think I'll go with Darren Waller of the Oakland Raiders, and that's because, he was a surprise to everyone, and I'm pretty sure he finished top 3 in PPR leagues last year for fantasy football tight ends. My only concern with him is the lack of touchdown production. However, if they start to involve him more and more in the offense, he was already a focal point. 90 receptions, 1,145 yards, but only 3 touchdowns. That's the big concern. He had basically just as many yards and catches as Travis Kelce. So he's a big factor in that Las Vegas Raiders offense. And if he can continue to be a staple in that offense, he's going to put up a ton of points, and he's going to be a top 5 fantasy football tight end. Of course, at that number 5 position, you got guys like Evan Ingram, he's gonna perform next year. I think he has a bounce back year. He dealt with injury. Austin Hooper, I don't think he's gonna have as much success on the Browns as he had on the Atlanta Falcons, but there's other great guys you can put there. Besides that though, there's all the other guys you can toss them up. But that's my top 5 for fantasy football tight ends next year, guys. Not, surprising at all, I don't believe. Nothing controversial there, but it is what it is. And now, I want to move on to defenses. That'll be my last, fantasy football position ranking for next year, because it's almost impossible to rank kickers. They're sort of interchangeable. I think almost every year at some point, sometimes I don't even draft a kicker. I just pick one. If I can't get Justin Tucker, if I can't get Harrison Butker, or Will Lutz, somebody takes him, I'm probably not taking a fantasy football kicker, and I just wait. I pick one up off of free agency, and, I interchange them as the weeks go on. Every week, almost, it seems like any fantasy football kicker can be the top scorer that week, and so it's almost impossible to rank them, because even in high-scoring offenses, high-flying offenses, maybe that kicker only gets extra points that day, so it definitely is very tough to rank, so we'll skip that for now. So let's move on to defenses, guys. Another position team that's hard to sort of rank on a year-to-year basis. I mean, last year it'd be very hard to, if you could go through and find me rankings that had, the Patriots number 1, the 49ers in the top 5, Ravens in the top 5, some people even had the Chiefs in the top 10 because of their sack total, and I think the Chiefs finished just outside the top 10 this year. So, it's very, very hard to rank defenses year to year on fantasy, according to fantasy football, just because, it's very unpredictable, and a lot of times we get caught up in the recency bias of it all, and, there were a ton of fantasy football preseason rankings, post-draft rankings that had the Chicago Bears being a top fantasy football defense, and the Chicago Bears finished this year as the number 16th ranked fantasy football defense. So, it's kind of sort of like going off a whim, but I'm going to give you guys my educated guesses at the top 5 fantasy football defenses for next year. So to start the list, I want to start with not the Patriots, but the Baltimore Ravens. The Baltimore Ravens have made some really good moves to shore up the defensive line and to, address one of their biggest weaknesses, which was stopping the run game. We saw in the playoffs, they got absolutely torn up by Derrick Henry, and they basically said, we think we're fine everywhere else. We clearly got destroyed by a great running back, so we're going to shore up that line and make sure that doesn't happen again. They still have Marcus Peters. They still have Marlon Humphrey. Their secondary is great. So shoring up that defensive line and making sure they could plug all the holes was a great move and a great idea. And I believe that they can definitely, finish as fantasy's number 1 scoring defense. For number 2, guys, I'm going to have the Pittsburgh Steelers. Now, I know they're in the same division as the Ravens. I'm not just trying to, pick that division and say, these have the best defenses. The Pittsburgh Steelers, guys, finishes, a top 3, top 2 fantasy football defense last year. They force a ton of turnovers. And, guys, for the past 2 years, they finished first in sacks. So they're generating a ton of pressure. They're generating a ton of turnovers. And that equals fantasy success. Last year they had 20 interceptions and 18 fumble recoveries, and they had 54 sacks. That's a ton of fantasy points. And while they didn't have, they don't have the easiest schedule next season, they didn't have the easiest schedule this year as well. So, we can rely on them to give us points every single week with sacks and turnovers. It's not that they're matchup proof, but it just seems like, no matter who they face, they're going to do solid. Their lowest, point total in the season was a -5, but that was at the first horrible game against the Patriots. After that, the lowest they scored was 3, and they had a ton of games over 10 points, and even, they even had 6 games with 15 or more points. So they're a reliable fantasy defense, and they're going to do well, guys. So keep them on your radar. I have them as my number 2 defense. For my number 3 defense, this is where I'll put the San Francisco 49ers. I don't want to fall into that trap of, saying, wow, this defense was absolutely amazing, so we're just going to bump them up just because they were good the year before. I don't want to keep doing that, but it's just hard not to. The 49ers finished, as a top fantasy football defense last year. And the only reason I don't have them, top 2 or even number 1, they just lost to Forrest Buckner, who was a huge piece of that defense. And I just, I want to tamper my expectations. When you lose a key piece on defense, it definitely affects your team. I mean, we saw it in the beginning of this year with the Kansas City Chiefs losing most of their pass rushers. We definitely had trouble with a pass rush this year, but of course, that ended up being fine in the end. I had the San Francisco 49ers as my number 3 defense. Look for them to, constantly take the ball away. They had, I think, 27 turnovers. Not as much as the Pittsburgh Steelers, but, they still can get it done, and they're not going to allow a ton of points and a ton of yards. So, San Francisco 49ers for my number 3 fantasy football defense. Now, for my number 4 defense, I'm going to give this to the Buffalo Bills, and mostly because their division is pretty easy. With Tom Brady gone, there really is no offensive threat in this division. I'm not scared of the Dolphins. I'm definitely not scared of the Jets. And without Tom Brady, the Patriots, I don't see them doing much on offense. So bump them up, because that's basically 6 easy games of year and 6 games of great fantasy points. Now, conversely, I'm going to put the Patriots as number 5 for my final defense in the top 5, because the same reason the Bills have. There's really not a potent offense in that division, and Bill Belichick is going to come out with a great defense. More often than not, the Patriots have a very solid defense, and, without Tom Brady, they're definitely going to have to be focusing on limiting the points scored against them. So, for my top 5 guys, I got the Ravens, Steelers, Niners, Bills, and the New England Patriots. And of course, some of these can be interchanged and you can move them up or down all around, but because, like I said, the defense is so unpredictable from year to year, but, look for those to be top fantasy football defenses next year and have them on your draft boards. With that, though, guys, we're going to take a short break and we're going to move on to our next topics right after. We're going to be talking Cam Newton, and hopefully we'll get into my wish list for the last segment of the show. So stay tuned, guys, and we'll be right back.
Are you looking to get your college football fix? Looking to get the latest news on your favorite school's team? The GSMC College Football Podcast is your ticket to all things college football. Join us as we talk college football from the national championship, the college rivalries, the bowl game, to the Heisman Trophy. To which conference is the best? We've got you covered for the Big Ten, SEC, Big 12, the Pac-12, ACC, and everything in between. Download the GSMC College Football Podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, Google Play, or anywhere you find podcasts. Just type GSMC in the search bar.
Hey there, everybody, and welcome back to the GSMC Fantasy Football Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. Alright, guys, we finally got done going through some of my preliminary rankings for the Fantasy Football 2020 season, and now we're going to move on to some more free agent stuff, because recently we've just found out that the Panthers are planning on releasing Cam Newton. Now, it's not a surprise to anyone at this point because, he didn't find any trade suitors and, a lot of people, including myself, wanted him to go to the Bears. But since, no teams are really doing physicals and, they saw the Panthers didn't really want Cam, they figured, why should we take a chance on Cam? Let's just take Nick Foles and ride with that. So, I don't know where to start in this whole story. The situation kind of sucks because I feel like the Panthers, they knew they weren't going to go ahead with Cam. They had already signed Teddy Bridgewater. They should have just released Cam Newton from the get-go. The thing is, they were being greedy, and they wanted to just get anything they could for Cam, and teams recognized that, hey, they want to get rid of him anyway, so why would we give them anything? It's just sort of it's a sucky situation, because I feel like had Cam been released at the start of free agency, we definitely would have seen him on a team already. We probably, we could have seen him on the Bears, who knows? And now it's just like he's sort of hanging in limbo. Like I mentioned, in previous episodes, Cam Newton, of course, he struggled recently, but he's by no means a scrub. He was a former MVP, and I know, you hear that all the time. Every show you're going to hear talk about Cam Newton is going to throw that around. They're going to throw the MVP word around and talk about that. I believe it was the 2015 season, but, They talk about it for a reason. It's not just to throw it around and say, hey, look, he was a former MVP. It's because we all know that Cam Newton has that potential. He's just been abused in the pocket, and he has had to deal with several injuries, and that's what's, made his play suffer. I don't believe it's because Cam Newton's, suddenly just regressed and become a worse football player. It's because he's playing through severe injury, and he's trying to tough it out, but it's just affecting his play too much. A shoulder injury is really going to affect how you throw the ball. So, as of right now, I'm really unsure what teams, he could go to, just because, I talked about the Los Angeles Chargers, which would be, I think a good fit for him. But the Chargers are staying strong with Tyrod Taylor. They've made it known that, they don't want to spend big on a quarterback as of right now. And, it's looking like they might draft their quarterback of the future and just have him learn under Tyrod Taylor, or possibly even take Tyrod's spot, but they don't want to get a veteran guy or pay a lot of money for a quarterback. They're content with having a game manager in Tyrod Taylor, and it doesn't look like they're going to make a move for Cam Newton anytime soon. A lot of people have thrown around the Patriots, but we have yet to see if they've shown any serious interest in Cam Newton. Like I said, I would love to see Cam Newton on the Patriots. I think it would be an interesting challenge for Bill Belichick to get this completely new type of guy. But at the moment, it just seems like the market for Cam Newton is really, really empty. And it sort of sucks, because with this whole chaos that's happening in the world with coronavirus and everyone basically being forced to stay indoors, and no events really happening and no one meeting, the NFL has suspended, the whole the physical program. Like new teams cannot bring players in for physicals, and so with Cam Newton's lingering injuries, if a team can't give him a physical and test if he's healthy and ready to play football, they're not going to sign him. So it's really unfortunate right now, and we might see Cam Newton on the free agency wire for much, much longer than he deserves to be, but it's just that's the circumstance at the moment. Who knows where he goes? Like I said, I'd like to see him go to the Patriots. I would have liked to see him go to the Chargers. But other than that, it's hard to think of many teams that would take that chance on Cam Newton without giving him a physical. Of course, a team like the Dolphins needs a quarterback, but they're probably gonna draft one. Another team that people have thrown around is the Las Vegas Raiders, but they have Derek Carr, and they picked up Marcus Mariota to sort of give Derek Carr some competition. The more and more this goes on, the more and more, I figured that those teams would have made a trade for him, and now that he's released, it just seems sort of dire and desperate at the moment. I'd love to see Cam Newton on a team next year as a starter, not as a backup, because I do feel like he can have a bounce-back season, and since he basically took this whole last season off and has been recovering, I'd like to see him finally healthy and finally with a good team, and playing to his full potential, because he can put up a lot of numbers on fantasy, guys, with his legs and with that big arm. We just have to see him on the right team with the right weapons. The only hope maybe I could see for him now is a reunion with Ron Rivera with the Washington Redskins, helping Dwayne Haskins learn, helping Dwayne Haskins, turn the ball over less and become a more sound quarterback. But we'll just have to see what happens in the coming days. It's an unfortunate situation, like I said, but, it happens. It happens, and unfortunately, it's just Cam Newton's turn to be part of this sort of cycle that is the business of the NFL. The bad news is, though, for teams like the Chicago Bears that may have wanted him, but things didn't work out, in a timely manner. Now they go ahead with Nick Foles. There's some teams that might have missed out on, a quarterback that they could have gone, a solid quarterback that could have been their QB for the future. So it's all, like I said, it's all messed up, and unfortunately we don't get to see Cam Newton in a Bears uniform, which is where I really think he would have landed had he been a free agent sooner, to replace Mitchell Trubisky. But as of right now, Carolina's parted ways with their franchise leader in passing yards and touchdowns, a former MVP, and, the cards are just up in the air right now as to where he'll go because, like I said, I really would like to see him reunite with Ron Rivera, but I just remembered they recently traded for Kyle Allen. So, it's a tough situation, and it's unfortunate to see him up in the air like this and in a tricky situation. But it is what it is, guys. And with that, we'll go into our final break for the day, and right after, we'll get into our final segment. So stick around, guys, and we'll be right back.
This is your ultimate stop for everything sports. The Golden State Media Concepts Sports Podcast. Should I say more? From the NFL, MLB, the NBA to MMA, it's all in here. The Golden State Media Concepts Sports Podcast. Listen now.
Hey there, everybody, and welcome back to the GSMC Fantasy Football Podcast. All right, guys, we're entering our last segment of the show. We just got done talking about Cam Newton's unfortunate situation, what might lie ahead for him. And now we're in our last segment, guys. I want to do Marcus's 3 wishes. All right, guys, I just want to get straight into it here. So, excuse me. We recently saw that 2 quarterbacks from the XFL have signed deals with NFL teams. PJ Tucker with the Panthers and Jordan Ta'amu with my Kansas City Chiefs. Now, my first wish of the day is going to be that these two find success or at least find a role in the NFL. Now, the reason why I wish that is because, I've talked about this before in previous episodes. I want for the XFL to be sort of a developmental league for the NFL. I understand, the NFL, maybe with some competition, could improve upon some things and it could be forced to, make some changes that the fans would like. However, it is going to be so hard to topple the mega giant that is the NFL that, before that happens, I would love to see a developmental league, not just have guys, be on practice squads or go straight from college to the NFL and that being their only outlet. If this continues and we see more players signing onto NFL teams from the XFL, it could become a working, lasting relationship between the two leagues. Now, mind you, of course, I want the XFL to have success in and of itself and not just be, for developmental players, because in that way, then the league wouldn't be able to sustain itself. All of its good players would constantly be leaving. But, if players start playing well and we're seeing exceptionally elite players in the XFL and, they have to play maybe a minimum amount of years and then they can make their way into the NFL, that would be really cool as well. Instead of just, going straight to college and not getting paid for their immense talents, having an option for guys to get recruited to XFL teams, that they'll have professional experience and be able to seamlessly transfer into the NFL. I think that could be very, very cool. And honestly, I just want them to succeed too, because one of them is the Kansas City Chiefs. So, God forbid anything happens to Patrick Mahomes, if we have Jordan Ta'amu, he comes in as a backup and he lights it up like he was in the XFL, that would be great. And hey, for the Panthers and PJ Tucker, I understand Teddy Bridgewater can get it done, but he's by no means, untouchable or super safe. If he starts slacking, maybe we'll see PJ Tucker take a few real regular season NFL snaps. We'll see. But that definitely would be my first wish for the day. My second wish, guys, is for the Washington Redskins to finally set Trent Williams free. I mean, this is a saga that's been continuing for a while with no real positive outcome for the Redskins in the future. You know, no one expects Trent Williams to ever be a Redskin again. He's literally come out and said, I will not play for this Redskins organization ever again. I don't understand what's the holdup with this situation. I don't know if they're just being greedy and want to force this trade, you know, but just let him go. Get him out of there somehow, some way. Trent Williams is an absolutely outstanding talent at the tackle position, and it's a shame that he's spending a bunch of time wasted just because the organization refuses to let him go. And I understand, you know, there's financial situations and financial implications, but this is just a situation that will not get better for either side until they part ways. You know, I want to see Trent Williams on another team, and to me, it doesn't make sense that a player of that caliber hasn't found a trade suitor at this point in time. You know, it doesn't feel like it's making any sense that the Redskins haven't been able to find a trade for Trent Williams, and the fact that they just won't let him go at this point. You know, it's very rare that we see, you know, players of that caliber, and I know it's a little bit different because had this been, you know, a star running back, let's say Christian McCaffrey was in this situation, or you know, you get someone like Derrick Henry or a star wide receiver like Michael Thomas in this situation, it's much different because, you know, we pay much more attention to it. And the fact that, you know, it's a shame that because he's an offensive lineman, this doesn't get as much press or as much pressure, it feels like, from the media, as, you know, another player at a different position would. But that would be my second wish, Trent Williams needs to be on another team. Find a way to get him out of Washington, guys. For like, this franchise is it's a mess, and I just wish that they would get this straightened out so that Trent Williams, an elite offensive lineman, could find a new home and continue his career as a great lineman. Now, for my last wish of the day, guys, it's one that we can all relate to, and I wish that this coronavirus chaos would end pretty soon. And I know it's one of those situations where it's going to get worse before it gets better. However, the world right now, you know, social media and everything is just, without sports, everything is just that much more dull. And to be honest, it's getting a little bit scary because it feels that this situation is going to stretch into the football season, and it's going to be very hard for, you know, guys like myself and sports podcasts to keep producing quality content for you guys and keeping you guys entertained. Of course, the show must go on, and we're going to bring you guys as much quality content as we can, but it's just to see a world without all the sports in general. You know, I know this is a fantasy football podcast, but, you know, I enjoy other sports as well. To see so many sports being affected by this, it is a tragedy. And so I hope that this can be, you know, I know this is not going to go away with a snap of fingers, but if we can get this situation contained, and, you know, we all have to do our part, guys. I know it might be difficult for some of the younger people, you know. I know, you know, teenagers, they want to get out and they want to go do things or go to the mall or whatever, but everyone in the world right now has to band together, and we just have to fight this thing together. And to be honest, guys, being forced to stay at home for many of us isn't that much of a big deal, and it's not that much different than what we would have been doing anyway, let's be honest. You know, especially my college students who, you know, stay in dorms all the time. So, you know, guys, you know, this is a time for the world to come together and you know, for the sake of other human beings. You know, I know a lot of people, you know, they say, I'm young, I'll be okay if I get the coronavirus. You know, okay, that's whatever. You can think that. But for the sake of other people, immunocompromised people, the elderly, you know, we have to make sure that we're not risking their lives just so that we can go outside and go to the club, go to the bar, go to the park because we feel like it. You know, this is something that's bigger than us. It's bigger than every individual person, so we have to act accordingly. If this gets worse, you know, we will be without sports for who knows how long. I mean, guys, the Olympics have been pushed to 2021 at this point because of the coronavirus. So, you know, when's the last time you remember anything happening to the Olympics? This is really, really serious and really, really huge. And whether you think the media is just making a big stir about it or not, you should be willing to help as a human being of this planet and just, you know, a sports fan. And yeah, like I said, just a human being. So with that, guys, that's my last wish for the day. I hope it wasn't too grim or too dark, but, you know, it's something we have to talk about here because it's happening, it's real, and it's serious. But with that, guys, I want to thank you, as always, for tuning in to the GSMC Fantasy Football Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. As always, guys, I want to ask that you leave a comment or a review, nice or bad, you know, to let us know what we're doing right or wrong so that we can improve for you guys. I also want to ask that you follow us on social media, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, because that really helps us. So with that, guys, that's the end of our show today. Stay strong, stay healthy, stay safe, and most importantly, just stay home. All right, guys, have a good night. We'll see you next time.
You've been listening to the Golden State Media Concepts Fantasy Football Podcast, part of the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. You can find this show and others like it at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Download our podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, and Google Play. Just type in GSMC to find all the shows from the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network, from movies to music, from sports to entertainment, and even weird news. You can also follow us on Twitter and on Facebook. Thank you, and we hope you have enjoyed today's program.